back to the Festival of Ideas Focus Day. If you haven't been here, my name is Matt Matravers. If you have been here, I'm sorry, my name's Matt Matravers. So this session is entitled The Rise of the Global South. I'm not going to introduce it because we have a fantastic panel, and they will be talking about the concept and its many and various manifestations and its significance. The panel is also so distinguished that their biographies run to several pages. So if I read out all of the many and varied things that they've done, there'd be no time to get to what they have to say or indeed to questions. So I'm going to give a very abbreviated version of their CVs. If you want to know more, you can look on the festival website. And the order in which we're going to go, the pattern of the session will be the same as the last one, which is the panelists will each give a very brief presentation. I might then pick up some themes, but importantly, what we will move to is Q&A and engagement with you, the audience. And we'll go in this order. So Sultan Barakat, former colleague of mine here at York, is now a professor in public policy at Qatar's Foundation Hamad bin Khalifa University and an honorary professor at the University of York. He is also Senior Associate Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute, a world-renowned scholar known for pioneering the study of war-torn societies and their recovery. Ambassador Androulla Kaminara is the inaugural distinguished diplomat in residence at Georgetown University in Qatar. She has 40 years of exceptional leadership in public service management and in diplomacy. She was the first female European Union ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, breaking the glass ceiling and working in multicultural, multinational, and multidisciplinary fields, and that's been the trademark of her career. Different order. Mo Cassimjee was a senior diplomat for South Africa for over 26 years. He served as deputy ambassador to Germany from 2016 to 2020, and prior to that served abroad in Washington, D.C., Uganda, and Senegal. He served in various positions at the Department of International Relations in South Africa, including Director of the African Union, German-speaking countries, Nordics, Baltics, Latin America and the Caribbean, and the European Union. And prior to joining the Foreign Service, he was a barrister in South Africa. Rahul Roy-Chaudhury is the Senior Fellow for South and Central Asia Defense, Strategy and Diplomacy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, where he's worked for over 20 years. His research and publications focus on India's domestic politics and foreign policy, South Asia security, and UK-India defense relations. So we have an astonishingly expert panel, and I'm going to hand over immediately to Sultan.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you for inviting me again. It's always lovely to be back in York. Maybe I'll start by shedding a light a little bit on what do we mean by the concept, at least how I understand it, because the Global South is really understood differently by different people and different countries. But if we take steps back into history and look at the end of the Cold War, then the countries emerged in broadly three categories: those who were defeated, those who won the war, and the former colonies who started to separate from their colonial powers and colonial masters. Around the mid-1950s, as communism started to take hold and develop, and Russia was taking a different view on the Marshall Plan and asserting itself differently from the direction that the West were taking economically as well as politically, the term Third World was introduced, and the world was divided into First World, as in the West, the North, the Second World, these are the communist countries and the socialist group around them, and the rest were put into category of Third World. Very quickly, running into 60s, 70s, more and more countries gained their independence. They started rebuilding themselves, started developing from, some of them from very little base. They were labeled the developing countries. The actual use of the South as a term was maybe used in the 1970s, 80s, but there are three important, I think, markers, events that have really highlighted its use and turned it from what used to be just a developmental stroke political definition into a political stroke ambitious undertaking. The first was in 1990, immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, and partly because of the fail of the West to deal with the Soviet Union in a reasonable way, it has led to the disintegration of the bloc, and some of those countries that were within the Second World World Order joined the Third and became known as the South, and others evolved into Europe and became part of the First World. Then came the defining moment, I think, in our contemporary history now, in the Ukraine war, when more and more of those southern countries, the bloc of countries that included the developing countries, some of the former countries that were the satellite of the Soviet Union, they started to develop a political opinion different from the West, particularly on the legality, but also the support for Ukraine, or what the West wanted them to be, is to be aggressive against Russia. So this group started to work closer with each other in that political term. And then more recently, and we'll come back to this, I think, later, with the Gaza war. The idea that South Africa can now take Israel, and by association, all the northern alliances of Israel, to the ICJ was unheard of a few years ago. And this is now probably the moment where the South is at its peak in terms of feeling emboldened and empowered. It's empowered to not only exert pressure on the North and to try and defy its traditional hegemony, but also empowered to project a different identity. And this is very important. Cultural identity for the South is important. Also empowered to present different economic models. And I'm sure in the panel we will talk more about the BRICS and the cooperation model that the South started to create in terms of working together, not necessarily creating military alliances. And this is a very big difference between how the South at the moment thinks and how the North continued to think. And I think the panel earlier this morning was a very great demonstration of how we still think that we need to kick harder. We need to, only way to protect ourselves is by making sure that there is a deterrence in terms of military. We need to spend more military and so on. In the South, you'd be surprised that they have a slightly different view of this. They don't mind. Russia now cooperates equally with China and has very good cooperation with India. They don't say, because India has a problem with China, then I have to take the side of either countries. China has made huge progress between Iran and Saudi Arabia, also on the same basis, without aligning themselves strongly with one side or the other. So there is, I think, a new, very interesting way of doing things based on greater ability to communicate, sharing more of the experience of being colonized, being deprived, being at the receiving end of the environmental impact, the global warming, etc., but more intending to cooperate rather than face each other militarily and or face the West militarily. The reason why I think the concept have picked up is really because of what they've seen in terms of decline in the North and in the West. And they must be sitting there watching very carefully. And they have a lot of stories to monitor. In the last maybe 10 years or so, we had 2-3 global economic crises, financial crises. All of them mostly were driven by private banking in the North and in the West. And we saw the very system that was set up by the United Nations and the laws that were intended to govern economic relationships being bypassed, and even the very capitalist concepts of supporting the private sector and so on also was not respected in order to counter those crises. Then we had more recently, the way the North conducted itself with the COVID-19, for example, and the corruption that came along with that. All of these issues are monitored outside Europe and the United States, and people look back at them and see to what extent the North is really making progress or not. There are many, many examples that I can go over, but the one that I think most striking at the moment is what's happening in Gaza. And I know in Britain there is a tendency not to talk about Gaza. And earlier today we were told it's an emotional subject. It's not an emotional subject. It's very basic from a Southern perspective. When those countries were created, the South collectively, someone came in and wrote the rules. And those rules are enshrined in the United Nations Charter. And they were intended for people to regulate the relationship amongst each other. Now, particularly countries of the South needed the law because of their relative weakness. They did not have the military to impose their opinion and so on. They can only rely on the rule of law. But to see it repeatedly being disrespected, broken, worked around, implemented selectively to suit our needs in the West is unacceptable. And this is why I think the current rise, is very, very important. It's not just about a specific people. It's about the fact that you are not consistently respecting the same values and the same law that you put together for the rest of the world, and which the world has joined in relatively goodwill, often without a choice. I mean, they had to do it. And then it doesn't get respected. Now, this has come at on the back of almost 20 years of breaking the rule, starting with the war on terrorism, 9/11 onwards. There's a whole list of issues where the rules were broken by the West, the way it conducted itself, the way human rights were compromised. The war in Afghanistan took 20 years. They spend more money in the United States in Afghanistan than they spend in rebuilding Europe and the Marshall Plan. And then for the rest of the world to watch the humiliating way in which the US had to withdraw and were defeated in Afghanistan, is not surprising then that they think our time has come. Really, we may have something different to offer to this globe. This globe is contained. Nobody is going to escape. But it doesn't have to be controlled entirely by a group of people that feel they have the right to it. There are other populations, the majority of the world live within the South. In fact, economically, within a few years, they were told by the World Bank, by 2030, India, China, and Indonesia will be amongst the 4 largest economies alongside the United States. So they have a lot at stake to count, to be listened to, and not to be threatened all the time. And I think this is a very important point. We can come back to it in terms of the deterrence. I mean, we're still talking about deterrence as having more weapons, but we all know that none of those nuclear weapons were really used since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and unlikely to be used again. And even if you look today at the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, Israel is unable to use its traditional deterrence, and that is to hit Beirut and Lebanon really hard every time Hezbollah threw a rocket onto Israel. They just simply cannot do it because of the politics that exist around us. And therefore, I think we have to think of different models. And I hope that from within the South, some of those ideas are coming up.
Thank you very much. Great, thank you. We'll move on to Androulla.
Thank you very much, Matt. First of all, I'd like to say how happy I am to be in York, and I'm very happy to have been included in this Festival of Ideas, which I just love the idea of that. So I will focus on, very, very quickly on 6 things, and I will just say a couple of lines on each one, and then we can come back in the question and answer. In order to talk about global South and is it rising, we have to see what are the global trends. It's rising or falling within what is happening globally. So in a nutshell, what is happening, we're seeing increasing fragmentation, reduced cooperation, international trade, which used to be more based on trade with whoever has the best value for money in a way. Now we're seeing a lot of the countries are trading with who are the countries that have the similar ideas than us. So decrease of cooperation, decrease of international trade. There have been the challenges. COVID was a big shock to the international global system, but climate change, very fundamental problem that the world has to face, and how climate change affects the West and the global South are totally different. So that's on the table. New technologies and how that's going to disrupt the future. We're seeing polycrisis rather than single crisis, and multipolarity from a unipolar world into multipolarity. Increased inequalities, both within countries and across countries. We're seeing technologies and the internet basically having the average citizen globally more aware and more having visual images of what's happening globally. And of course, there's a global risk of disinformation. So, second thing is, what is the global rules-based system? And what are we seeing currently? The UN is quite clearly unable to address the challenges that exist. It's Ukraine, Gaza. There's been for many, many decades the story of the reform of the UN system, but the reform that never was. And then we're seeing structures, organizations, institutions like the ICJ and the recent ruling against the recent hearings against Israel brought about by South Africa. We saw Guatemala taking Germany to the ICJ for helping Israel in that war. I mean, regardless of which side of that conflict you are on, those are very big changes that are happening. We saw countries like Vanuatu proposing new rules for climate change. So Global South raising its voice, and they've been sort of flexing their muscles with respect to that. So what has been happening to the Global North? Well, as far as I'm concerned, he has lost his moral ground, linking to also what Sultan said. The leadership role of the Global North to keep the world secure has been eroded. Values, I have a background in the European institutions for 30 years, and I used to do development and humanitarian. And also, I was an ambassador for 30 years. We were talking about the European values and democracy and rule of law and things like this. I think when we say those words now to some of these countries in the global South, they just say, what have you done in the case of notably Gaza, but in other crises? How consistent are you? So we've lost this moral ground, and unfortunately, and I talk about the EU, we have been unable to have a common position. I am not even saying, again, which side of the conflict you're on. But unfortunately, the European Union has not been able to have a common position on one of the biggest crises that are happening now at Gaza. With Ukraine, we struggled, but we managed it. We did get a common position. But if such big changes are happening in the world and you're not there because you're split, your member states are split about which side of the conflict, then that weakens you a lot. So you have polarization both within the EU, US, and the West. There's increases in inequalities, and today's elections, which are forecasted to produce a lot of far-right parties, is one of the effects of what these happen. So Global South, I'm getting to the point, as I've mentioned, we've seen incredible initiatives being taken by countries that people would not have considered possible, let's say, a few years back. And the Global South is using whatever institutions exist, I think for the first time, forcibly, and to promote their own views and their own interests. we are seeing incredible things like, for example, the Maldives have banned Israelis from visiting the Maltese, and we've seen the US trying to produce legislation that would stop the Maltese banning Israelis from visiting the country. Before, you know, these types of small countries would not have been given, you know, a point on the radar screen. We see Qatar, 300,000 people, nationals, producing press releases with the US about the current negotiations. So you see what used to be countries that were not in the international spotlight being there. And the other major thing that we're seeing is that groups of countries like the African Union, for which people can criticize that, but nonetheless, the African Union has had some major achievements. We're seeing BRICS countries, we're seeing ECOWAS in West Africa, we're seeing ASEAN dealing with South Asian countries coming together and being able, in some cases, to talk with one voice. Just some numbers, I think, are indicative. At the ICJ hearing, there was something like 50 entities took the floor. There were 3 institutions which were groups of countries. Organization of Islamic countries, the Arab states, and the African Union. These are organizations with 50-something countries. And they were able to define a line and to express that line. So the rise of these global South groupings cannot be underestimated. So but we're seeing, and I agree with Sultan, that they're not choosing to be part of one group. There's multiple alliances that countries are choosing to do. So has the global North taken notice of what's happening and how they're reacting? To this, I would just mention one country, France. France was very much ex-colonial power in the west of Africa. Recently, France was expelled from Niger. 75 to 80% of France's energy mix is from nuclear, and about 20% of that nuclear comes from Niger. So has the global North taken count? I'm sure they're very much aware of not having those links increases their own insecurity. There's all sorts of examples we can take from other countries. If I take another country from the P5, UK, it chose Brexit, so now, in my view, is much weakened than what it was before. So it brings me to what is the future? Yeah, finish. Global, so the global South, in my view, very correctly, is rising. But can we assume that they will take over the system? I don't think so. Even with a weakened US and EU, there are better alternatives, I think, to Russia and China, which are on the rise. There are opportunities from these global organizations that are African Union and BRICS and other integration. There are opportunities, but this would take time. And this phase means that the world order is more unpredictable. And the other thing we have to consider that in the future, if we look at what is currently within the group of Global South, a lot of the biggest countries in the current Global South would not be, let's say, in 10, 20 years in the Global South because their economies are rising very fast. It's Russia, China, India, Indonesia, and many other countries. So the globals, if we want to see a trend, what is the Global South will even change. So a mixed picture and one to be watched. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Fabulous. Thank you very much. Mo.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's an absolute pleasure being here. Thank you for the invitation. I think for me what's so important is that we are discussing the global south. We heard this morning people want to invest more in arms, more in security, but maybe we need to invest in greater understanding of each other. I think that's where peace lies. So I think this is a fantastic opportunity for us to try and discuss some of these issues. Why do we talk about the rise of the global south? What has happened all of a sudden? Something must have changed. And I wonder what it was. There's two things that has happened, is that suddenly you have emerging powers amongst the global south. If you look at India, Indonesia, Turkey, South Africa, and various countries around the world, Vietnam, you find that these countries are starting to grow economically in various degrees and are starting to kind of show their strength and show what they can do on the international stage. But for me, most importantly, and having studied what the global order looks like, is that what is happening is that this was reported in the National Intelligence Council report of the United States in 2012 and 2019. And what they said was that there's no major hegemonic power anymore. Before you had a bipolar world order, you had the United States, which had absolute power, you had Russia, there was power. But all of a sudden, the 21st century, countries have a deficit of power. So yes, you talk about a powerful China, but they're not as powerful as one would imagine. You talk about a powerful United States, but they're not as powerful as they used to be. So as a result, what do these countries, major countries, do? They need to court other countries in the South. So they need to court South Africa, they need to court Vietnam. They even need to court countries in the Pacific Islands, like Samoa, like Fiji. And suddenly China is rushing to Fiji, America is rushing to Fiji, the EU is rushing to Fiji. So there's this deficit of power, and they now need to compensate for that deficit. So this is creating an entire new world order and opportunities for other countries to come into play. I'm going to quote my favorite philosopher, and since we are in the university, and that's Antonio Gramsci. And he said, the old world is dying. It is dying. But the new world struggles to be born. And in that struggle, we get morbid consequences, and we can see what is happening in Ukraine, in Palestine. So the world is in a state of flux. Power is diffused. We have an uncertain global order. But it is within this context that a new global order is being developed. And the global south is asserting itself. Now, the question I have from this morning's panel, which certain concerns were raised because the idea of we had come about. Who is we and who is they? When are we going to get to us as a common humanity? Because that's when we'll have peace. So I think Gramsci is important in this respect. So what can the West do, the so-called West? Well, they need to engage with the global south in a different way. They need to hear the other side's view. But the global south are not all innocent either, and we don't want to get in this kind of context of the global south being some victim. And if you look at some internal policies on human rights and rule of law, they don't add up. But what's important, and I'm coming from South Africa, I'm coming from a place where Mandela managed to come out of 27 years imprisonment, sat around the table and said, let's have peace amongst different people, and the country is celebrating 30 years of freedom. So maybe it's a much more idealistic view, and I do understand the reality of the present global world order with the wars that are going on, the cyber attacks and so forth. But can we have a vision of where we're going to? Are we saying that this is the world? We are heading for another war. This is the world. We are heading for more tension. This is the world we're living in. It's leading to more misunderstanding. But can we as the audience and can we as the panelists have a greater vision to have a different world for our children? And I think this is what the debate needs to be. Let's not get stuck in global north, global south, east and west. Can we break those divisions? Because what concerns me is that we are looking at these concepts from an old paradigm. We use the word non-alignment. That is a 1969 concept. We use various Cold War, we use East, West, Global South, Global North. Somehow we're getting stuck in the same routine, in the same trend. So I'm challenging myself and challenging people around here. Can we break that down? How many of us here are from the global south? Well, I live in Britain. I'm global north as well, and I want to be a bridge between the two. I don't want to be a divider between the two. So those are the things. I still have a bit of time. I've been quite strict in that way. I learned that in Germany, stick to your time.
We don't stereotype at all.
I think the other issue is that how do we engage with this world? How do we go forward? And there's been an interesting article and quotation by Ivan Krastev, who wrote in the Financial Mail, where he said the global south no longer wants to be on the menu. They want to be on the table. And I think this is important. When people are sitting around, that China needs to be heard, India needs to be heard, South Africa needs to be heard, just as America needs to be heard. But what I'm also encouraged about is the UK in its thinking, basically from a government level, from various sectors of British society involved in foreign policy. There is a sense now, if you start reading the literature and analysis, that what they are saying is that we need a partnership with the global south. We can't tell them that if they vote in a certain way, it's us versus them. We need to respect the different views. We need to understand the different views. So that's very encouraging. And you have middle powers. For example, the UK is a traditional middle power, and you have emerging middle power. So you have this middle ground that can come together and start talking to each other. What people forget is that there are American companies in Russia still operating today. When it comes to China, yes, there's a threat in some respect, but there's trade in another respect. The United States may have restrictions on sensitive technology with China, but there's tremendous amount of trade going on in other sectors with China. So the world is a much more complicated place than us versus them. A binary view of the world is now out of the window. And we have to start engaging with the world from a much broader perspective. So I think, Matt, these are just my few points. And thank you once again. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done on understanding this relationship and how the global south is growing. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roy. Thank you, and I suspect in any future global vision, India is going to be a big player. So over to Rahul.
Thank you, Matt. There have been several references to India by my panelists, and what I'd like to do in the next 6 to 7 minutes is to look at India's perception of what is variously called the Global South, but also look at India's role in relation to the Global South. And I'd like to end with 4 questions, 2 of which have been stimulated by my panelists' comments. So I think that it'd be interesting to look at some of their perspectives as well as questions. But let me begin by saying that clearly India is and is proud to be a member of the Global South. But India is not just a member of the Global South. It's also a country that aspires for a lead role in world affairs, to have an impact and influence in global affairs. And we see this by 2 or 3 factors. The first, undoubtedly, is the population. Today, India is the largest country in the world in terms of population, having overtaken China a couple of months ago. A huge 1,400 million people live in India. Secondly, India is the fastest growing major economy in the world. What this means is that its annual growth rates economically for the last 3 years post-COVID have been about 7 to 8% annually. They've been higher earlier. And what the 7 to 8% means is that in the last few years, from about a decade ago, India was the 9th largest economy in the world. Today, it is the 5th largest economy in the world, having overtaken UK last year. Its GDP is just short of $4 trillion. And if the economy continues to grow at the rates of 7 to 8% that I just mentioned, in the next 3 to 4 years, India will overtake both Japan and Germany to become the 3rd largest economic power in the world. And that is an important fact for all Indian decision makers. In fact, a few minutes from now, the Indian Prime Minister Modi will be sworn in for a third consecutive time. He's been Prime Minister for the last 10 years, and he has another 5-year term. And one of the aspirations in his term that he's put across is that by the time his third term ends in 2029, India will be the third largest economy in the world. But another factor is there when we look at how India sees itself as part of the global south, and that is that India has a number of development projects, economic activities in countries of the global south. It has development projects in about 78 countries. It has provided aid to countries, food, fuel, fertilizers, especially in relation and the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war. COVID. During COVID, India's manufacture of the AstraZeneca vaccine was supplied to 99 countries around the world. And within India, there was some criticism. Why is India exporting the COVID vaccine when Indians themselves haven't received all of it? So the first point I want to make is clearly India is a member of the global south. It has strong links and relationships with the global south, but it aspires for something bigger. What is this something bigger? What role does India aspire for in this relationship? I would argue that India sees itself as the voice of the global south. It wants to be a facilitator, a medium in terms of the relationships between the global south and, for want of a better term, the global north. Why do I say this? For 3 reasons. Firstly, in India's diplomatic rhetoric, it is very clear that the terminology, the voice of the global south, is a strong element of what it seeks to aspire. In 2023, India uniquely held 2 summits, one in January 2023 and the other in November 2023. And they were called, surprisingly, Voice of the Global South summits. And they brought together 125 countries at the level of heads of government, ministers, etc. Out of the 125 countries, 47 countries were from Africa. And the idea for India was to get the views of the global south and to sort of get a better understanding of what the global south wanted and relate it, and this is the second point I want to put in, as a host of the G20 summit, the 20 largest economies in the world, which India hosted in September 2023, India wanted to convey the points of the global south into the G20. And it did that successfully. It also did something else, which was fascinating, which is that through deft diplomacy, India was able to get the African Union made a permanent member of the G20. And that will continue for the future. The third thing that India did was also in terms of the India-Africa relationship, to build on the India-Africa relationship through summits that have taken place. Now, let me end by the 4 questions that I put to myself. And the first question is there a contradiction in India's policies of being the voice of the global south, but at the same time aspiring for something with a much more greater political role on the world stage? Secondly, what could the challenge be from China? It's a country that we haven't spoken much about in this panel, but for India, it's a country that it does focus much, much more in terms of the diplomatic and the security aspect. China also wants to be a voice of the global south. What are the elements of competition that could be there between India and China in relation to be the voice of the global south? That is, if the global south want either country to be the voice. And the third question that flows from the discussion earlier is, there seems to be an impression I've been given by the panelists that there's consensus within the global south on issues. There's absolutely no consensus. In the same way, the global north, there's no consensus in the global south. So the third question to me is, does India really want to try to seek consensus of the global south? There are problems. We talked about Gaza. India was one of the first countries to condemn terrorism in Israel. It's also now providing support diplomatically to Gaza. It has striven for a two-state solution, but India and Israel continue to have a strong relationship. Russia, India, China. The more Russia is dependent on China, the more problematic it will be for India in relation to China. So the question really is that the consensus part of it. I mean, does India really want to get into it? And let me end by the fourth question, to me, which is the most important one, actually. If I were to analyze India's position from outside the government, I would say that it's hugely important for India to work with the global south, the countries we've talked about, the 125, 30 countries, formerly of the 134 countries in the UN, but to work with the global south to ensure that India is seen as a representative of the global south for a particular end. And that end, I would argue, is to change the rigid system in New York and have an expansion of the UN Security Council, where a country like India should become, and other countries, permanent members of an expanded UN Security Council. That should be the primary objective. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much to all of you. Your questions have already provoked at least one response. I'll come, yeah.
I think the question vis-à-vis the UN and the Security Council is not, should India be part of it or not? It's a valid question, or should France and the UK still be part of it? But how do the countries of the Security Council behave? And that's a much bigger question. There was, just for the record, there was an initiative which was supported by over 100 countries in summer 22, and which basically said we cannot have countries from the Security Council vetoing resolutions when these resolutions are referring to mass massacre and violations of human rights. At that time, this was supported very much by the US, because it was Russia that put a resolution about Ukraine. France, I mean the P5, including France, 25 years has not used the veto, because it said this is not the way we should resolve problems. The UK, I don't know exactly how many years, but has not been using it. So the question is not, can we all join to be part of the ones that rule, and can we all join to be part of the countries that can tell the rest of the world or have more power than the rest of the world? The question is, how can we have a more coherent world applying to rules? If you bring it down to what individuals do, would any of the people here accept a legal system or in the UK or anywhere, where if you are from X group, you can get away with more than if you are from Y group? That's the basis. That's what brings us together, that we should have rules applied across the board and not who is the one deciding on the rules.
I don't want to turn this into a dialogue, but I'll give you a very quick response, and then I'll...
So Ambassador, I would respectfully argue that, that when you have rules and you have members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council chosen in 1945, that things have to change. If you're serious about the Global South, you have to have Global South representation in the UN Security Council, and you will have responsible behavior from states. And I would sort of, argue that I'm not saying just because I'm an Indian that, India should be a member. There should be others as well. But we need to understand that the world has changed since 1945, and the Global South needs to be represented in a forum which does take critical decision making. And the reason the UN Security Council is not as effective now is because most countries, a large number of countries, are turning away. The G20 is an example of that. To look at the G20 composition, you look at quadrilaterals, minilaterals that have been set up. That's where the power now is. But I would still argue that you need to change the structure if you really want to have the Global South play a part in the future of the world.
Okay, I'm just going to I'm going to ask one question of a couple of the panelists. I won't, and then open it up to the floor. So please start considering your questions, and then we'll use the microphones. But the question I just want to pick up from Rahul really is, I mean, to what degree does it make sense to think of, I mean, you raised this yourself in the third question, the voice of the Global South. If the Global South is itself, such a fractured thing, I mean, if you're a small Pacific Island ocean state that is facing an existential crisis through sea level increases, you don't share, it seems to me, an enormous amount with China. And yet, both are apparently part of the Global South, and both are something for which countries are vying to be the voice. But that strikes me as a bit like being the voice of, the National Front and the Communist Party. I mean, they're just not the same thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, because there are certain areas where they're quite far apart and there isn't unity. But the underlying issue remains that the countries of the Global South have the common challenge of trying to become part of a new global world order and to have an equal voice. So, for example, recently we had the Barbados Initiative on Climate Change, and this brought together countries from the Global South that may not be specifically impacted like the Caribbean, but it spoke to the representation and type of financing that the IMF will do specifically for such countries. So in groupings like the G20, in NAM, G77, most of the issues they're talking about, you can find commonalities, whether it's India, whether it's Fiji, or whether it's Indonesia, or whether it's Angola. So there is that common underlying factor which still exists. And your point being that you can't have a United Nations system that's created in 1945. You cannot have an international financial architecture that's created in a bygone era when you have the Global South wanting to play its part and role there. So there are commonalities, there are differences. Yes, countries act in the national interests, and there is a push for them to become part of something. For example, even with Ukraine, I mean, most of the Global South, and sometimes people get lost, voted in favor of the resolution condemning Russia. So there was a degree of consensus in many respects. Others abstained for their own, for different reasons and whatever that may be. But I think the underlying commonality is the rule of law and international law. Whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Middle East, whether it's another part of the world. If there's a violation of international law and the violation of the UN Charter, then the principles should prevail. It shouldn't be the politics that prevail. And I think this is the issue.
Yes, if I can pick up on that, I very much agree with your last statement. But I think also to request or to dream that so many countries, the Global South is, I don't know exactly, it depends how you count them, but anyway, over 100 plus countries will have one voice. Why are we setting that bar so high? They can agree on climate change, but disagree on something else. So that is not, in my view, the primary problem to solve, the one voice. It's a more inclusive approach to these problems and more coherent approach to these problems.
I agree. I think it would be interesting to go back and look at the United Nations General Assembly voting pattern. Then you know who's excluded and who's in and who's out. The Global South feels they've been excluded from the big decisions that actually get implemented because of Security Council power. But in reality, it's the Global North that is excluded from the rest of the world where it's heading. You look at the votes, it's the United States, some of its allies, and a couple of islands that really matter or don't matter, that vote alongside the United States. So there is something very interesting going on. The North uses military threat and continues to use it, as we heard earlier this morning, and we genuinely believe this is the way forward. We also use sanctions, and we think that's the way also to get our way, whether we're right or not. And both have really backfired over the last 20, 30 years. The use of force in Afghanistan for 20 years did not yield anything. all the interventions, the way we broke the rules in Libya, in Syria, in Sudan, you name it, everywhere. There hasn't been a real solid benefit out of that for stability. But we still cannot depart from that. And I find it really strange that we cannot learn from history. And unfortunately, what Israel is doing and the way they're standing by Israel now is exactly the same. They've not learned from history. They've not learned from what happened in Europe. They've not learned of what happened elsewhere during the colonization. And we are repeating the same pattern. We're standing behind it blindly. We're not even willing to question it. The fact that the United States Congress now is looking into ways to get at Karim, the QC, from the ICC, from the International Court of Criminal Court, for daring to suggest that the Israeli Prime Minister should be brought to court is crazy. I mean, what are you saying to the rest of the world about these rules and the order that we've set up and the whole theater that we do with the security? It doesn't matter where you sit. If the law is not respected by the ones who have the ultimate veto, then it has no meaning for the rest of the world, I think.
Okay, now I'm going to turn to the audience, and you'll get a chance, I promise, Rahul. So there's a question right at the back. So please, let me just quickly explain. Please wait for the microphone to come to you. When you've finished asking your question, please pass the microphone back to the microphone carrier, and please keep your question short and to the point.
I just want to agree with what Her Excellency Androulla Kaminara is saying about, brings me back to the school I come from, the epistemology of decolonization and the work with Dr. Benjamin Laureano in the Mexican Front of Human Rights since the 1950s. And something that is prevalent is that we want to integrate from other systems into the power systems, but we forget the systemic change. So what she's trying to say about the systemic change is very important, especially from my experience as an Indigenous Rights Commissioner for many years. I remember how it became onto trying to get in the power, but forgetting the principles and the diversity of all the different situations and circumstances that different places hold. So the inclusiveness of the systemic change is very important. The way that the systems allow the possibility, open the bars onto different ways of approach and integration. So I just want to, it's not a question, it's just like an agreement and to support that point that you gave.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Let's assume for a moment that there is a genuine will of the West to cooperate with the Global South and treat them like peers, so Global South countries, of course. How could we work together with the Global South countries to make them reach their goals and at the same time face global challenges like climate change without making them feel patronized or forced to comply?
Who wants to take that?
I'll take that.
Yeah, no.
That one. No, I think what is needed is a partnership. So you've got to start with that principle. And then obviously when going into kind of discussions, the tendency in the past has been, we in the West have a solution, we want to impose the solution. I think that is changing. It's now saying we want to assist. What is your problem? So it's in Africa, it's called African Solutions to African Problems. So it's about letting the solutions come about organically. But I thought I'll just also use the opportunity, for example, because we're moving into another divide that could come across, and that's under AI. the marginalization of the global south as a result of the AI, because, for example, algorithms based in the north are being applied in villages in Kenya, and the outcomes are causing problems. So basically, it's the idea of how to go into these societies, understand what they need, and then bring, because that will create a lot of goodwill, and then bring the solutions and the knowledge and the innovative solutions that come out of the West, and then apply that to assist others. I think this is the role, that the model that needs to come about. Thanks.
Anyone else? Okay, now we'll go to the lady in the green, please.
Thank you very much. It was really excellent and thought-provoking panel. I really thank each individual speaker. My question is actually just going back, echoing Antonio Gramsci's "The old world is dying." It's just nothing new, because we knew that post-Western order, especially neoliberal agenda, many IR scholars are already discussing this, even in the US. So the West is, in a sense, we focus on more Europe and EU, but we didn't mention US as part of the West. And there's a fracture within the global North as well, not only the global South. That's my comment on that issue. But my question is actually going back to the third question. You posed whether India versus China, and I would say there's also going back to the issue about the values. For me, the answer is very clear, whether we want to live under India is representing as a functioning democracy and China as an authoritarian state, one-party system. So there is still a continuing divide between, in terms of values. Ukraine crisis is the same. And Gaza, I'm really grateful to the first speaker. I think this is a really historic moment, 75 years that injustice has been going on. So if you are looking from the Middle East perspective, for instance, we know that there was these underlying issues. The West didn't want to engage. So that's where, do we really need a united voice to represent the global South, is my question. Because any united voice is going to come with power, and as we know, power is exercised and responsibilities, and our role as humanity is actually speaking the truth to power. So whose truth we are going to speak in that case, if it's India or China? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Rahul, would you like to?
Sure, thank you for the question. I think it's an important point you raised about values, the importance of values, and value-based decision-making and international policy. But for a large part of the world, for most countries, it's also interest-based. What are the interests of these countries, and how do they leverage these interests for their own objectives? And at times you will see a clash between values and interests. And so I would agree with you. Yes, if you look at India versus China in terms of values, I think clearly the case is there. But to be honest, also when you look at India, we've seen that there's a tension that plays on. And we saw this in the Russia-Ukraine war. India's decision, in fact, policy towards the Russia-Ukraine war in one sentence is, it has not condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it has not condoned it either. And there has been tension clearly between the values and India's focus on the rules-based international order versus the interest that it has in terms of the arms relationship, etc., with Russia. So what I'm arguing is that I think one needs to see this to break it down in a way, because we'll never get a clear answer as to how these countries look at it. And there'll always be a mix of values and interests. Ideally, it should have been values only, but realpolitik is it will be interest-based. And that is something that that will have to be factored for all countries. In fact, I would argue that there is actually a huge appetite, there should be, for funded research on the policies of the South, global South. What are the policies? What are their focus on values, interests, other issues? And that is something that actually will provide a better sense and a better understanding of the relationship between the North and the South. And I don't think there is enough being done in the university systems anywhere in the world on this.
Okay, I'll come to you in a second. I just want to pick up this issue of values, and I want to make absolutely clear that I don't doubt for 1 second that the West and the UK and the US has been deeply hypocritical, that the implementation of that the rule-based order has been inconsistent, and so on. But I'm a bit puzzled by what the solution is, because on the one hand, some of the panelists seem to be suggesting the solution is to have the rule-based order properly implemented and fairly implemented by people with equal influence, whether that's through membership of the P5 or through reform of how the P5 works. So that's one model that says there is a world order. It is based on equality, human rights, equality between the sexes, freedom of expression, all of the rest of it. It just needs better and more inclusive implementation. But frankly, it seems to me that's not a plausible picture of China or Saudi Arabia. China or Saudi Arabia do not believe in equality between the sexes, don't believe in freedom of expression. And so I'm not clear whether, perhaps I'll address this directly to you, Sultan, whether your thought is the international world order is inconsistent and we need to make it consistent around these values, or the international world order is inconsistent and we need to make it pluralistic. That is, we need not to say, these are the values. We need to say, these are England's values or the United States' values, but if your values are women can't drive, that's what your values are. And I'm just a bit confused as to which of those two directions you want to go in.
Yes, well, I think the order is not built on values. Values were introduced to support the Western view of the order. The order was built on the state sovereignty. That you have states, we all think differently, we come in this conference hall and we vote and we agree. But that has now, we've departed from that, particularly following the fall of the Soviet Union, that it is now seen as the West's duty to spread those values. Now, some of those values are universal and accepted in all cultures, all religions. Some are controversial. I mean, this month we have, for example, the Pride month here. You cannot float the idea in China or in Russia or in the Arab Muslim world. And we have to accept the difference. So there are these values, as long as you're not coming into my country to work against my value here, that's fine. But they are not universal. We have to be very careful. This is, I think, the difference. So the values themselves are also changing. Our values are changing with our experience, with who's coming to the table. The environment only recently became an issue. Maybe for some nations, it is much more important value to protect the environment than maybe to talk about democracy. And then democracy, which we have packaged in these values and we push down people's throat and we insist this is the best way for you to govern. And they look at the transition between Trump and Biden and they laugh. The last election. They say, what democracy? I mean, I don't know this broadcast, but I work very closely with the Afghans, the Taliban. I mediated between them and the United States. And they always make 2 points. One is, what's the difference between one-party rule in the United States and us ruling in Afghanistan now as one party? Then you say, well, these people were elected. They say, but look at the way they were elected. They're all being lobbied by somebody who paid for them to come into this office. There's no genuine, real interpretation of those values in our homeland. I mean, in Britain, I can't remember now how many prime ministers we've had in the last 3-4 years. So democracy is not really working at its home, but we still insist to push it to everybody. I'm not against it, but I think we should also listen to them and see what are different ways of governance and so on. And then somehow, it's mostly about humility, really, and respect of the other, and appreciation that we all share the same earth. No one was born with a greater responsibility because they're white or they're blue-eyed, and they have to take responsibility on behalf of everybody else. And then the issue of alliances. I mean, we talked a little bit about NATO earlier, and Russia. The same group of countries, they introduced in the 1990s the concept of responsibility to protect. which basically gives other nations the right to intervene against the sovereignty of certain nations when they see that this nation is acting against the interest of its people. Now, we implemented that in Yugoslavia, in Libya, and a few other parts of the world. When the Russians said, we have a minority Russians live in Ukraine under very difficult circumstances. They've been oppressed, they've been excluded, they don't have right for education in their language, they don't. We have the responsibility to protect them. Everybody stood up and said, you misunderstood the concept. Okay, you are going to invade Ukraine. Yeah. So that consistency, I think, is the third value. You have to be consistent throughout.
Okay, as I said, I'm happy to accept the inconsistency point. I just want to check whether the other panelists are happy with your anti-universalism and your pluralism about values.
My point would, sorry.
Yes.
My point would be that, okay, there are certain values that have been written down and have been in place for so many years, but also certain of these terms or of these understanding have been evolving. It has not always been fixed on what exactly we mean by certain terms. I'll follow on the democracy. Of course, we agree with democracy. But if you have a person that has a leader that comes into power after democratic elections, but his sole purpose is to make richer the top 5%, is that okay? You understand the notions have changed. It's democracy, we put the tick. He came in through elections, even though maybe 30% voted and the rest didn't even bother to go in. But is that what we accept a leader to be aiming at making everybody poor and say 3% richer? So these notions have now evolved, and somehow how we discuss about them, we should not just stick to the words democratic elections tick, but go a bit further down and say what is the purpose of having a democratic government is to try and make the life of the people better, let's say.
Okay. Mo, and then I'll come back.
Okay, I'm trying to summarize and get to your point, because I did chair a meeting on shared values, and South Africa's constitution is an extremely liberal one. And how do you find consensus when you're dealing with other countries on the continent? But I think it's important, and I guess I'm coming from the background, having been part of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, is that for me, democracy is sacrosanct. I mean, I will fight for democracy. I will live under democracy. I think it gives rights of people. And I think I make no bones about that from where I come from. So I think those values are important. And I think liberal democracy, yes, there may be other issues, but I think it's paramount, it's important. I mean, India is the largest democracy. They've just undertaken a massive exercise. South Africa has completed elections, and I think we need to keep democracy. It's very important. There may be flaws, but there's no substitute at the moment. I will not live in a society where I'm not given the freedom to decide for myself who I can vote for. Yes, I may not have all the influence, but I think coming from the society where we came from under apartheid, I think it's absolutely vital in terms of the shared values. I think the United Nations, you raised a very important point. There's procedural fairness and then there's substantive fairness. And I think for me, yes, in the UN you'll get procedural fairness if you have it open to all other countries, but you may not have substantive fairness, and that's why you have the Charter. I mean, South Africa was also very clear that Russia had infringed upon the sovereignty of Ukraine. Maybe there were other issues later on, but the first statement remains, including other conflicts in the world. But people will interpret international law the way they also want to. So we need to distinguish between this. But you raised a very important point, because we think if we have procedural fairness, everything will go away. In politics and international relations, countries will act in their national interest. And just to pick up a point that you had mentioned, and I'd forgotten, under Quad, India is in partnership with the United States, Japan, and Australia. So the countries, there's a what's very interesting is that there are green shoots of convergence. Although we are seeing it as global north, global south, We're looking at G20 in India, G20 in Brazil, G20 in South Africa, and that's bringing together all the world's nations, north, south, east, west, coming together in a room and agreeing to communicate. So I prefer to be more positive and see green shoots. Thank you.
Excellent. That's not bad.
Thank you for this insightful conversation this afternoon. In breaking down concepts, my question is on identity in the name Global South. Who came up with it? The name Global South comes with the idea that this is associated with the evolving term for developing countries. However, with the rise of Global South groupings and the unpredictability of world order, I wonder if the name Global South creates limitation in support of the new global order and having a seat at the table, unless if name does not matter and name goes with identity.
Good. Is the label Global South still useful or not?
Well, people now talk about the global majority as opposed to global south and or the rest of the world, yes.
But I think it's so good.
Okay.
No.
So I think we shouldn't sort of, lose focus on, on definitions of the global south, etc. I mean, I think to me, what the global south conveys is really a large group of countries who have a different perspective from, the traditional powerful countries, and what the ambassador was saying also about substantive, impact. That is important. So I wouldn't focus too much on the definition of the global south. I think it's more what it presents that is key.
Huh?
Yeah, I think, that's a good point that you mentioned, Rahul. I think it had connotations, third world, developing world, and I think people are comfortable with the word global south. But even there's articles being written whether it donates and puts a certain box or a certain idea around that, a certain identity, as you correctly said. But the conclusion from this particular author was that we need to take this concept and grow it, because people seem to be happy with it and are using it to better the world order. So I think as it stands now, I think it is a useful, but I'm hoping it outgrows itself, but that's another stage of an idealistic way of looking at the world, but let's see.
Yeah, again, I would agree. For example, it was used to split the world into developing and developed. But as I said in the introduction, some of the countries that are part of the global south are going to be, India being an example, one of the top economies in the world. So where do you place it? It helps in certain analysis when you're talking about to make a separation between, let's say, West and the rest, or it used to be the third world. All of these names keep changing. It's useful, but it should not tie everybody into that group.
Gentleman there.
Thank you for being here to speak today. It's been very informative. I'm just wondering, there are a lot of conflicts around the world today. Obviously, Russia, Ukraine, there's the issue with China and Taiwan, there's issue of Malaysia and other places like Sudan that's been forgotten about. I'm just going to go back last year when people were sending arms to Ukraine to get ready for their counter-offensive. Now, it was the usual suspects. It was Germany, Spain, France, the places you'd think were natural. The one that caught my eye, however, was Switzerland sending old tanks just as a sort of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just something they did. But when I saw that, I just considered that they'd thrown away 250 years of neutrality. And we can see the issues of that just this coming week, because there's a Ukraine peace conference in Switzerland that no one's taking particularly seriously, even the people who are organising it. Like, I don't think Joe Biden's going either. So I'm just thinking, do you believe the Global South can fill this void of a reliably neutral territory to discuss conflict resolution now that Switzerland has decided to throw that away?
Can I come to you, Sultan? Because Clearly, Qatar has been playing a very significant role. It's a role that traditionally, I guess, was played by Norway in some respects.
Yes.
So can we, yeah.
Well, the answer is yes. There are areas that are emerging. Qatar is one of those, but South Africa also is important in Africa, playing a role for mediation. But again, they're struggling because the North still dominates the scene, and it is seen as the place to come for conflict resolution. There's a huge competition. I mean, I can speak for hours about the experience we had with Afghanistan, coming from Qatar, mediating there, and the competition we had from Germany and other more established countries that felt it's their area. The South should not really be stepping into this sphere. They won't be able to resolve it. And if they resolve it, it's not going to be sustainable. It's going to be just a temporary pause and so on. So yes, it is an area that is, I think, is growing. Interestingly, China has just started building more and more interest in this. And the Chinese, as you heard before, I mean, they're not really relying on being present globally with their military power. They have resisted for a long time to come, for example, into the Gulf to protect the oil and gas that they use most. And they rely on the US to play the policeman in the Gulf to protect an oil that goes to China. You know. But they have recently started to develop their ability to mediate conflicts. Their mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia was very important. More recently, a few weeks ago, they've held a meeting between Hamas and Fatah to try and organize the Palestinians, the Palestinian voice together. So, yes, there are areas that are rising around the world. Yeah.
I think we shouldn't consider it, is it more the global north that's doing the mediation or the global south? I think a much more flexible approach needs to be taken, and to choose the countries that are able to react in a particular situation. To my mind, the case of the Gambia comes to mind, tiny country in Africa, tabling a case against Myanmar for the Rohingya. I mean, it was a small country in Africa taking such interest and putting a global problem on the map that was happening, you know, on the other side of the world. So we shouldn't look at monopolies of who can do those jobs, but depending on which countries can progress the agenda, that can put global values and challenge those that are breaking those global values, we should go with them rather than saying monopoly for the North, monopoly for the South, or any combination of any of those. So, and I see that as a positive change. We are seeing more and more of those cases, and I see that as a positive change for world peace.
But also, I mean, maybe linked to this, and going back to the Ukraine, given the history, and we're only about 80 years old history, Germany, Austria, Switzerland should never roll across the borders with Russia. It's full stop. You should help them to remain neutral. If you have an issue with Russia, resolve it, but without allowing Putin to play this psychology with the Russian people, that Germans are rolling over the border again. They're using German tanks, they're using Swiss technology, Austria. This is, I mean, I'm outside this region I come from, but I've read the history. It's basic, that's what you should do. But if the intention is to really provoke Russia to the level where there's no choice but to go to war because there are other interests, then fine, you continue to poke them and wait for the big reaction, which undoubtedly, I think at some stage is going to come. So far, they have tried to limit it as much as possible, the war. And I don't think it's because of lack of resources. We all know what kind of weapons they have and what they're capable of doing. And we all know that things can also go wrong. You know, accidents can happen. So we have to be much more strategic the way we approach these conflicts. And that wisdom, I think, is now missing in the West.
Okay, we can squeeze in another couple of questions. There's a lady in the black.
Do you think the resistance of the global north to take the south seriously is partly to do with colonialism, the past, that we dominated for many years? And will economics, the growth in their economies, change that as often it has in history? Because it seems to me that there is some resistance because of that. Countries that were once ruled by us, other European countries. I'm not sure that you're always... your actual position is not always taken completely seriously.
Good, thank you. I'm going to exercise chair's discretion and hand that to my fellow African.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, definitely the whole power relationship is based on it has its genesis in colonization and oppression and the type of relationship that existed between the West and countries, the third world or the developing world or the global south. But I think that's what's so fascinating at the moment, is that dynamic is changing. I mean, China used to be a superpower. It lost its superpower. It's regaining its superpower. It's always been a very advanced civilization. So yes, things are changing, and that changes. And the world is changing. People's views about how they relate to other people are changing. We're moving further and further away from a kind of colonization, oppression mindset. There's a new generation of people that are focused maybe on the rule of law, look at treating people with greater dignity and respect, and human rights coming to the fore. So definitely there's a change, but it's also a change within the global south themselves that are starting to develop and take the agency and stop being victims and moving along that line. So that's my...
Great, thank you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the remaining two questions, the gentleman in grey and the gentleman in black and pink, and then I'm not going to answer your questions. I'm going to take the two questions together and then turn to each of you for final words, and you can pick up whatever you want to. So if you could make it brief, thank you.
Do you think that new technology and the internet and connectivity will make it easier for people to understand each other across the world and across the global south and the north?
Good, thank you. Does the internet unite us or divide us? And then the gentleman there.
What will the role of regional associations be going forward, since we've seen that they've been quite divided on how to respond to issues such as the EU over Gaza and ECOWAS and the AU with coups in Africa? Do they have a future going forward as actual forums for discussion and policy?
Excellent, a very important question. Do they have a role going forward regionally? So I'm going to go in reverse order from the way we started and just get your final thoughts. You can pick up on those questions or any other thoughts you want to give. Rahul.
Thank you. On regional organization, I think they have a tremendous future ahead of them, and not just the ones you mentioned, but other ones. And the reason for that, I would argue, is that on some issues, because of the standoff that has taken place in the United Nations over the permanent membership of the UN Security Council and the lack of any effective mechanism towards expansion, that countries now are sort of focusing on regional organization. There have been what have been called the formation of quadrilaterals, trilaterals, minilaterals in different parts of the world, where they're actually looking at how to provide better governance in these areas. So I would think that is an important area to look at. On the internet, I think it unites, but also can divide also, because I mean, I don't have a Twitter account, but anyone who has a Twitter account, anyone who makes a statement in social media, I mean, the response that takes place can be actually not a force multiplier, but a force divider if you're trying to build confidence and relationships. And my last point I want to say generally is that I would agree with Ambassador. I mean, we are looking at the possibility of a systemic shift in global politics and global power. And one word that is important that was brought up is partnerships. We have to see how best to provide, to be imaginative in our thinking of how to encourage partnerships between the global north and the global south if we want to move forward. And in addition to partnership, I would say imagination is hugely important. New ideas, tremendously important.
No, thank you very much. I think what's driving the process is there's a blurring of lines between domestic policy and foreign policy. And I think what happens globally is impacting on people locally. So what we are hoping to see is that there's a greater impetus for governments to cooperate as opposed to go into conflict, because conflict impacts on all societies. So in time, hopefully this concept of partnership between the global south and global north will start to grow, and there'll be a group of countries that will start coming together to say, let's start working together, let's start seeing whether we can get peace and prosperity going on in the world as opposed to more conflict.
On the technology question, I think the internet united us up to a certain level. What I'm very concerned about is the spreading of artificial intelligence. And the way that the technology works, it looks at what the information out there is and, replies, let's say, to whatever question you may pose. And what's out there is sexist, it's racist, it's based on, the last 50, 100 years of all the worst side of humanity. And if it replies in that sense, I mean, experts are saying about gender equality, for example, that it would create a bigger problem a bigger split between men and women, because what's out there is sexist. So it uses that logic to provide answers. And the technology is moving too fast for anybody to rein it in, let's say. That I worry a lot about. About the regional organizations, I do believe they have a role. It's an evolving role. Maybe when they were created, they had one, let's say, one vision of where they wanted to go, but reality is showing us that the other things are happening. And I'm glad that there are more regional organizations being formed, and the existing ones should evolve if they want to survive. Thank you.
And a final and upbeat and positive message from Professor Barakat.
Okay. Let me start with the positive. On the internet, obviously, it's been absolutely amazing advancement, including in the South. I mean, it has democratized their access to opinion, and they gave people voice, which wasn't there a few years ago. Even farmers in the middle of nowhere now can check the price of their products. They can make more informed judgments based on access to information that wasn't there before. The challenge, I think, in its governance. How are we going to govern it collectively when it's owned only by certain groups in the world? And until now, there has been a major resistance to create a governing body for the internet to hold people responsible and accountable for what goes on the internet and how it is dealt with. And until that is dealt with, I think it's very difficult to be equitably beneficial to everyone. In terms of the issue on politics, what I worry most about is the rise of ultranationalism, both in the West in particular, but also in the South amongst countries that are edging towards the West, the developing countries. And that will probably mean that in a few years' time, there will be more in common between the average in the South and the average person in Europe, bypassing their state. The states and the government will be all run by these ultra-nationalist views, and there are more and more in common developing between the average citizen here and in the South, which may be a good thing or could be total mess. I don't know. And on regional institutions, I think there is no doubt that they can play a role, but they're not consistent in terms of their efficiency. I come from a region with the Arab League that is totally useless. I mean, they haven't done anything remotely constructive in the last 30, 40 years, and they can't get their work together and so on. But ASEAN has played a major role. The African Union is fantastic in the way it's taken on responsibility.
Great, thank you very much. We have, in half an hour, another fabulous panel on elections and election interference and who runs the world. So please do return in half an hour. But in the meantime, can I ask you to thank this wonderful panel for a really fascinating session.